My name is Karen Myers, and I am with the Portage County Business Council. Again, good morning, and thank you for being here. I'd like to thank Lynette Arnhart for her presentation in advance today, and to TeamLogic IT for their sponsorship of this program. We certainly appreciate their support. And I also want to wish everyone happy holidays and to be well. Lynn, I know that you are going to be talking a lot about your background, so I don't want to steal that thunder away. But I do want to publicly thank you for your service. Lynn will tell us more about her background, but she is here today, as we all know, to present metrics that matter. Lynn, take it away.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and start by sharing my screen here, and that way we'll be able to, you'll be able to see my slides. Here we're going to share this one. There you go. Can you see that now?
We can, Lynn. Looks great.
Okay, fabulous. So what I wanted to talk about today is metrics, about what they do for us and how we can make them matter, about how to use metrics to drive meaningful analysis, discussion, and decisions. So what I'm sharing today is information and knowledge that I've learned in more than 30 years of analysis and leadership. So it kind of leads to the question of who am I and why listen to me? So I'll start with, I provided a list for you. People tend to be big fans of numbered lists. So here's a numbered list for you. So I grew up in the area. I graduated from Clintonville High School. I went to the military academy and spent the next 29 years in the Army. During that time, I became a degreed operations research analyst, and I spent a lot of time doing analysis and assessments, particularly on operations in Afghanistan, at the Pentagon, different things we were doing, how we're, measuring how well we were doing and the things that we needed to change in order to accomplish the goals and the objectives that are laid out in our plan. And so I did some Army-wide studies and analysis where I was the deputy director of an analytical agency, and then I was the director of analysis and assessments at Central Command and led the national assessment for the counter-Islamic State fight. So I have an extensive background in analysis, which includes understanding of problems, assessments, and metrics. And then after 29 years, I left the Army and realized that I wanted to work for myself. And so now I'm applying some of those same techniques here in business to myself. And there's a direct correlation in terms of how we can use these tools to help improve our business performance. So the question is, why do metrics matter? So, and I'll start with that question because I think it's important. And I found that there's 5 really important things about metrics, and they start with, they help you define the problem, because we need to have a understanding of what the problem is to develop metrics. So if I'm going to make a decision about problem based on a metric, I need to have the problem defined to begin with. I usually find that writing out a problem definition is very helpful because it starts to outline what that problem is. But more important than that is really understanding that problem, because problems have different aspects, and we'll hit on this more later, but a problem that we see at first is rarely the full problem. It's just a lot of times one aspect of the problem. And as you start to delve into it, you start to understand more and more about that problem. And then based on that problem, we have to develop options to address the problem. And as you develop options to address the problem, these are the things that we use to build a business strategy, a business plan, to build our goals and objectives. So I would say that these first three things actually drive the metrics. The last two things I'm going to talk about are things where the metrics help us. So as you've built your options for how you're going to address the problem, you've decided on a strategy, you've built out goals and objectives. The next piece of things is you have to assign accountability for accomplishing the goals and objectives that you've outlined in your plan. And so metrics help build an accountability for the problems that we're dealing with, for the courses of action that we're taking. And then they help us measure progress on those solutions of those problems. So when I look at metrics, what I see is metrics are really, really all about the problem. And I wanted to share a little example with you to help illustrate what I'm trying to say here. And so this example came from a friend of mine who deployed to help General Petraeus in Iraq. And he told me that when he got there, the people were trying to solve the problem. They did not have a sufficient number of trained Iraqi soldiers in the Iraqi army units. And so the metric that they were using was the numbers of soldiers who were completing training every month. And when they started looking at those, they found that there was a mismatch, that they were training more than enough soldiers to completely staff the Iraqi army units, but yet the army units didn't have enough trained soldiers. So he quickly keyed in on the fact that there was a mismatch between the problem and the metric, because the metric showed one thing, but the problem showed something else. And as he started to dive into the problem, what he really found was that the problem itself was misdiagnosed. They hadn't spent enough time studying the problem to understand that the real problem was keeping the trained soldiers in the units, meaning that the soldiers were trained and they were going to the units, but they didn't stay. So they had a problem with soldiers walking away from the units and not returning. So the real problem was attrition. It wasn't training. And so that's why I say your metrics are all about your problem. So that brings us to a discussion of the problem. So getting to metrics that really matter means understanding the problem. So as I had mentioned, you want to think critically about the problem. Start asking, why is this happening? How is this happening? What are the related and underlying issues to the problem we have? And that leads you to be able to develop that written problem definition. And the other thing we've got to think about is, as we think about the problems that we have, is it a problem or is it a symptom? And the example I like to use is, okay, I have a runny nose. That's not really the problem. That's a symptom. It might be a symptom of a cold. It might be symptoms of an allergy. But in either case, it's not the real problem that needs to be addressed in order to solve the issue at hand. So I like to ask, how do you tell the difference? And in general, symptoms tend to have a cause. Problems, when you get to the root of the problem, it exists more than it has a cause. And so it's one of the things that you find when you think critically about the problem is, and start decomposing it, looking at each of the pieces that wind up into the problem, you start to be able to sort out problems and symptoms. And so the next piece of things that you have to address when you're considering problems and how to develop options to deal with it, and therefore metrics, is what are the assumptions, what are the constraints, and what are the limitations? Assumptions are missing pieces of information pertaining to the problem. There are things that we don't know are true, but we use to be true in order to enable us to move forward with the problem. A constraint is something that limits our ability on a solution. So, you know, if I were to be building desks and I only had 4 pieces of plywood, I can only build as many desks as I have plywood. That's a constraint on the problem. A limitation on the problem is another factor that impacts what you can or cannot do. So if I only have plywood, I can't build steel chairs. You know, that's a limitation on my solution, is that if I'm building chairs and I only have wood, then my solution has to be wood chairs and not metal chairs. And so that's it's a way of looking at a problem, saying, okay, within what parameters do these solutions apply, or do these options apply, and when do the assumptions or solutions become invalid? And so it's a means of putting bounds on your problem, and again, it helps you identify which metrics as you go forward may be applicable and which may not. And so once you understand the problem, you can now start thinking about the development of solutions and the selection between those solutions. And once you've got those solutions, you've developed a plan for how you're going to get after it. And then you start to ask yourself, okay, how do I know when my problem is solved? And you know when your problem is solved via an assessment process. An assessment process is a continuous and critical evaluation of the situations or the activities in which you're undertaking. They help inform your decisions initially on your strategies, goals, objectives, and activities, but they also help ascertain the progress that you're making toward the goals or activity. The assessment helps to identify gaps, shortfalls, opportunities, and risks in your current and planned activities. And so the process that you're going through as you're looking at where you are, either in developing your plan or in continuing monitoring and assessment of your plan, is you start to think through these different things, and you will identify new facets of the problem. You will identify shortfalls in resources or scheduling or failures. You will find that there's opportunities where there's things that are occurring now that weren't occurring when you originally made the plan, and you'll find that there's hazards that could negatively impact the progress against your goal or objective. So this brings us back around to the question of what is a metric. So a metric is a measurable piece of data. And I like to think of metrics in terms of metrics are bits of data. Data is developed into information. Information is developed into knowledge. Knowledge is used to inform the decisions of leadership. And so data in and of itself can be subjective, qualitative, or quantitative. Subjective means an individual's judgment about something. And it may be a case of, well, you know, I was talking to this individual and they didn't come across like they sounded like they wanted to buy my product. Okay, that's my judgment of what my potential client may have thought about my pitch. It's subjective data. Qualitative data is observed facts. And so I can say, you know, Karen is wearing a blue shirt. That's an observed fact. It's qualitative because it's an observation. It's not quantitative because it's a single observation. It becomes quantitative when I see Karen every day and I count how many days out of the week, how many days out of the month, how many days out of the year, Karen wears a blue blouse. And then I can say, 4 days this week, Karen wore a blue blouse. It's now quantitative information. It's something that I'm able to count. Metrics are usually only quantitative, but both subjective and qualitative data can be turned into quantitative data over time. And so as we're working with metrics and applying them to our business plan and to the goals and objectives within our business plan, we're typically looking at a metric over a period of time. We're assessing progress over a period of time. And so what we find is all three types of information can be useful, and we can use those metrics then to inform the decisions that our leadership has to make. So that brings us back around to building the business plan. So business plans should be built from the problems. A business plan should be built to address business problems. It should be built off of an assessment and reassessed periodically. It should have defined objectives and as well as metrics. So as we build our business plan, we're going to say, what is the business problem that is being solved? We have a baseline that talks about where are we now. We have goals and objectives that say where we want to go, and we quantify them by saying what specifically we're looking to accomplish, when we want to accomplish it in terms of dates, where do we want it to be done if there's something that's location specific. We build a plan for how are we going to get there, and then we build into that plan how will we know if we're making progress or if we need to make adjustments to achieve our goals. And so what we find is that metrics inform every part of our plan. So this is just one of the points to take home. Every plan should be built on objectives, and every objective should have built-in metrics. We should never be trying to add the metrics after we've built the plan, and we should never be trying to assess the plan before it's built. I've done that before. That was one of the things we actually had to do in our counter-Islamic fight assessment. Was we had to build an assessment that went to the 4-star general officer, up through the National Counterterrorism Center, up to the Pentagon, and eventually over to the president, building the assessment before the plan was fully built and before we knew what all of the objectives were. And so it's difficult to do. It leads to a lot of change when you're trying to do those things, because the plan changes as you build the information. This is why when you're doing building a business plan, they ask you to do analysis and assessment up front in terms of what the current environment is before you build out your objectives. So I just wanted to take and build out an example, a partial example. And let's suppose that as we look at our business plan, we're doing a review and we find that our revenue is insufficient according to what we've outlined in our business plan. And so as we start looking at that, and the question becomes, is insufficient revenue the problem, or is it a symptom? What is really the problem? What data do I need to understand if that is really the problem? What data do I have? And then again, what constraints, limitations, and assumptions do I have on the problem? So as we go through our business plan goals, our analysis identified that the revenue was low. We looked at the problem a little further, and we found that the revenue was low because the new sales were low. New sales were low because we didn't have sufficient numbers of cold calls was one of the causes. So we had a metric that measured the numbers of cold calls, that measured the number of new sales, that gave us that information. So we were able to then adjust our plan to call for improved cold calling, and more new sales. And so we've now updated our business plan based on those metrics. And what we've done here is we've outlined and updated our plan. The next question is, how do we apply our metrics to our adjusted business plan? And we want to make sure that the metrics that we choose are particular to the business problem that we're using. And so we look at that analytically. We find that the solutions impact the plan, that impact the objectives, and we build plans using SMART goals and SMART objectives. And what that means is SMART is an acronym for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. And so if we're going to increase our cold calls, we need to build metrics that enable us to measure the activities and the accomplishments that lead back to the key part of the objective, which is the increased revenue. And so we use that by building the SMART goals, and that makes our metrics SMART also. So if we're going to go back and reconstruct our objectives so that it is SMART, we already know we're pretty specific in terms of what. We want to increase the revenue by increasing cold calling, but there's still some key pieces that are missing. For instance, the who, the how many, the in what time frame, and the how success is measured. So a reconstructed objective used by the sales team might read, each salesperson increases their cold calls by X amount. Now this would be a percentage, or it could be a hard number, in order to increase the number of new customers and new revenue acquired by the company. So we've laid out a very specific and measurable objective for our sales team. So, and this objective relates the cold calls to the new customers to new revenue. So cold calls, customers, and revenues are all specific, measurable, and relevant to the problem that we've laid out. Managers need to ensure that those objectives are attainable. And this is where I also like to add resourcing. And it's because in order for goals and objectives to be attainable, they need to be properly resourced. A salesperson who's already making cold calls for 8 hours a day can't increase their input unless something else changes. For instance, are they authorized overtime? Are the scripts that they use shortened in length? Are there some other means of increasing efficiency that can be found, such as the documentation process becomes streamlined? And so you start to understand how resourcing plays into attainability. And then the last thing is the time period needs to be added to that. So the time period is the periodicity at which each objective should be reviewed. Is it reviewed weekly? Is it reviewed monthly? Is it reviewed quarterly? You know, is it reviewed annually? And it's possible to have objectives and metrics that are reviewed on different time schedules depending upon the availability of the metrics and how often the data that informs those metrics refreshes. So for the plan to be implemented and successful, we need to track and measure performance against the objectives. We need the continuing assessments on how our sales team is performing as measured by their metrics so that we can update as we need to. And for this, we tend to we make an assessment plan to inform our business plan. So coming back to the cold calling metrics, we've developed an assessment plan, and in that assessment plan, it should outline the metrics that are used by our sales team. So for each time period, the number of dials will help us measure how many additional dials were made by each person in comparison to the baseline or what they were already doing at the time we put the plan in place. However, dials in and of themselves are not directly related to increased revenue. So we may want to look at additional metrics. Metrics such as qualified leads tells us how well the increased numbers of calls have worked in terms of putting valuation on the leads that are more likely to add to increased revenue. We may also measure, how many dials does it take in order to get a lead? How does this change over the time? How many appointments have been set? If we've increased the number of dials that our cold calling team is making, but they're not setting any more appointments, then they've increased activity without really increasing benefit to the company. So the next piece of things is we've increased the number of dials. How have the new customers increased? Have they increased? What are the proportions of the increase? How many more dials does it take to gain another new customer? And then you can also look at revenue per new customer and how does it change or how does it compare to your previous revenue per customer? And so as you look at those things over time, they show you your effectiveness of your cold calling campaign. And you may find that there's limits to what you can achieve through that objective, which then is an indicator that you may need to look at alternative methods of increasing your revenue. So things that you may not have thought were an issue could then later be highlighted as issues because your metrics are showing the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of what you're currently doing. And so each metric that you use has to have a definition and it has to have a threshold. So a lot of times you may have two thresholds on a metric because you may have a baseline or starting metric, and then you may have another threshold that says this level indicates success or this level represents achievement of the objective we've outlined for ourselves. By keeping those metrics consistent over time and monitoring for changes, it helps you build a lot of information about the effectiveness of your business activities. So the other thing I wanted to say about assessment is it has some unique challenges. Every assessment within an organization needs a champion because otherwise you can have plans and objectives and metrics, but if nobody's championing it, you will have people will be, yeah, we got it, but it doesn't ever really get consistently monitored or changes made based on the monitoring of those metrics over time. And so the assessment needs to be driven from the top. It needs to have continuing emphasis on it. And if possible, have somebody assigned that the champion is a disinterested, impartial, honest broker type individual within the organization, meaning that they're a person of responsibility and leadership in the organization, but who perhaps does not have direct responsibility for the accomplishment of any of the metrics that are being monitored for the objectives within the plan. And that helps to ensure the veracity and validity of the objectives, sub-objectives, and the information that gets reported to leadership. It helps ensure the continuity of the plan and the objectives. You also have to be aware that every manager and every employee has an interest in making themselves look good. So, having somebody who can review the metrics independently is beneficial to an organization. And then the fourth thing is that assessment can lead to perceptions that need management. And so you want to prevent perceptions of micromanaging, prevent perceptions of being spied upon, and prevent perceptions or actual altering of the information or metrics in ways that are not reflective of what's really going on. So just some cautions and things to think about as you're working an assessment program to inform your business plan going forward in time. So as I mentioned, as we look at our assessments, our metrics can highlight gaps, shortfalls, opportunities, and risks. So building on our example that I've been using, let's assume that Pat, the company's CIO, has been appointed as the Chief Assessment Officer. As he analyzes the metrics and information that are provided by the various departments for the quarterly assessment, his evaluation can help evaluate the business plan for gaps, shortfalls, opportunities, and risks. This information can be used by the company decision makers to help adjust or realign our business strategy, our business plan or goals, and help modify objectives inside the plan. As Pat goes through the information, it shows that the company is clearly not getting the desired increases in revenue despite some increases in cold calls. Pat uses two methods to assess and analyze the situation deeper. The first is strategic questions. It goes back to identifying problems and factors impacting progress and opportunities that allow the team to make recommendations to improve the progress. It also helps Pat understand how metrics may interrelate or impact one another. For instance, some goals may be dependent upon other goals, either at the same time or in serial. So alternatively, too much performance on one goal or objective may limit progress on another objective or another goal. So going back to our example, we might ask why we haven't got the total number of cold calls that our plan expected. And interviews from and input from our salesperson show that there's a shortfall because our team has got 5 salespeople, but they only have 4 outgoing phone lines. And in order to reach the goal that is set in our plan, we need a minimum of 4.5 phone lines to be in use at any time. So that's identified a shortfall in our resourcing, meaning that when you go back to our objectives, we had an attainability issue. We might also ask how we can improve cold calling efficiency. And this question is designed to highlight opportunities that we might find, and we may find that there's an opportunity to improve our scripting to make it shorter, more concise, so that our salespeople can get through it more quickly, again, which then enables them to make more cold calls and potentially get more customers. We can ask what internal or external factors may be limiting the company's performance. This question is designed to identify risks, hazards, and threats. So the second method I like to use is called a gap analysis. And in a gap analysis, we create buckets or bins that are mutually exclusive, independent states of the environment that represent continuous progress and outline all the conditions that could exist for our goal or objective, from complete and utter failure to complete and wonderful goal completion. And you assess progress to be at the furthest level for which all of the conditions have been met. And so the conditions for the next bin outline the effort that needs to be made in order to move the progress along. And so because we've outlined those conditions, we're able to quickly identify where those gaps may be, and they may represent areas where additional resources are needed or policies need to be changed. And so the next slide shows an example of just some quick bins that I built for our sales calling team. And so a weekly baseline is 100 calls per agent, 500 calls total, 3 new customers, and $3,000 in new revenue. So we know right now that that level or anything less than that level represents complete failure from where we started in our business plan. Okay, building on that, we're able to build what we think is total success, and then build out some bins in between there that represent slight success, fair success, moderate success, so that as we look at our particular metrics, we can communicate to leadership where we are along the lines in terms of creating progress against the goal we've outlined in our business problem. So as we look at this, you know, you can look at fair success, and it says, okay, we've got a total of 700 calls. We're average, each agent is making 140 calls. We've got 5 new customers, and we've got 5,000 in new sales. So as you look at that, you can say we're about halfway to where we need to be in order to achieve our objective. And so, but keep in mind, you have to satisfy all of the conditions in any one of the bins to be at that point of progress. So if I have one of my agents is only making 165 calls a week, which bin do I fit in? Or the question really becomes, what is the best bin we could be in if our agents are making 165 calls a week? So the best bin we could be in would be fair success, assuming all of the other factors were met. So if we had, you know, a total of 900 calls, 8 new customers, and 9,000 in sales, but we still had one agent making 165 calls, we would still be in the fair success bin, because they have not met the criteria for the moderate success bin. And so, moving on, I just want to go back for a second and just remind you that we've looked for, in our analysis, gaps, shortfalls, opportunities, and risks. What we're able to do is we're able to take those things and easily put it into the business school outlined strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. They are very, very much the same as you look at them. And you can see here that I've taken what we had on the previous slide and transferred it to how or what we might find if we looked at a SWOT analysis. In general, I tend to prefer to use gaps and shortfalls more than weaknesses, because for me, it helps me to better see where the business systems may have overlooked something and where my business may need better resourcing. And then the binning helps understand how the various goals and objectives work together holistically. But I still find looking at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats a useful construct in which to examine my metrics as well. So the bottom line comes back to, we need to use our metrics to inform leaders and to inform business decisions. So no matter which construct we're choosing to use, the point of metrics is developing, tracking information that business leaders use to make decisions about future operations. So the things we need to think about and keep in mind is that it takes time to develop, monitor, maintain metrics. We need to know who needs to contribute, what those data requirements are. I've also put up here, you know, some things to think about. You might need to know, you know, what do you need to know about your customers? Here's some ideas, you know, for metrics regarding your customer base that you may need to know, you know, if you are in, you know, sales business, or sometimes, you know, any type of business where you have to attain a client base. you need to know about your resources, and keep in mind that your cash and your accounts receivable are also resources. You've got metrics for those things, but as you're looking at your resources, what do you have available? Are they sufficient to meet your business plan? You know, are you efficiently utilizing all of your resources? What does it cost to use your trade-offs? Or what does it cost to use your resources? And what are the trade-offs between the resources that you have available to you in terms of how you are employing them and how are you utilizing them? And then the last thing that leaders really need to understand metrics for as they're making decisions is risk. And so I apologize for the use of this metric. It is from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff publication on risk. I use it because it does a really good job of outlining a framework for which to think about risk. And so we start by considering risk with respect to the business strategy, business plan, the business goals and objectives. And so that's number one on this slide. That's the problem framing. That is the risk to what? So if we go back to the company's plan to increase revenue, you know, that is risk to what? So as we're developing metrics that look at risk, we're saying, what are the hazards or threats to our ability to increase our revenue, which is our ability to increase the cold calling. So the second piece of this is the risk assessment. So this is asking, what are the particular things that may cause the threat? So possible answers to that may be the marketing and sales budget is too low. Another might be our pricing or our competitors' new or improved product. The third piece then is the risk judgment. So this is how we characterize the risk, how we think about it. Using the metrics we've already built for each objective, we can assess the likelihood and the consequence of the risk. The likelihood is thought about typically as a continuous probability from 0% never going to happen to 100% always going to happen, as the consequence tends to be thought about on a Likert scale, where you've got buckets of consequence, where it's a low consequence, a moderate consequence, a significant consequence, or a high, extreme, or devastating consequence. Putting those two things together, you can characterize your risk on a graphic like this. This is something I've used a number of times to communicate risk to leadership, because it's very, very easy to help them visualize how much risk. And the other piece of things that we do as we're looking at risk, I'm going to take you back just a second to, if you look at 3B on this slide, is a risk evaluation. When we bring risks forward to leadership, we think about, you know, what risk do they need to know about? What risk can I, at my level, judge to be an acceptable risk that doesn't need to be brought forward? And so, for instance, you know, I may judge that the risk of the telephone network going down is so low that I'm essentially willing to ignore it. And then I bring the remainder of the risks forward for the leadership to understand. And so I wanted to use a couple of examples here. So if I consider the risk of a new competitor with a better product, we've judged the probability of that risk is 40% likely, but the consequence is significant. So it corresponds to marker number 1 on the graphic. Marker number 2 represents innovation of a company's product so that our product is immediately obsolete. It's highly unlikely, but it would cause extreme harm to us. The third risk is the internet goes out or works intermittently for up to 1 day. In our neighborhood, we consider that to be 80% likely, but the consequence is moderate. And then the fourth risk is that we've got severe storm damage to our business facility. The Farmers Almanac has predicted a really bad winter, and we've had some roofing problems that we haven't been able to address yet, and so we assess that as probable in terms of happening with devastating consequences for us in the short term. So that's kind of how you would use a graphic like this and use your metrics to present risk to leadership. And then we return to this slide just briefly to say, okay, now what are we going to do about that risk? There's essentially 4 means of addressing risks, and those 4 means of addressing risks are to accept it, meaning you chose to do nothing, or you're in a position to do nothing about it. You avoid the risk by making decisions that help you avoid it. You reduce the risk by changing your plans or your operations, or you transfer the risk, typically by moving it to a contractor or by having insurance. And so if we come back to our examples, we've got, here's the examples we were looking at, but we can take those risks and reduce, avoid, accept, and transfer them. So our new competitor, we reduce that risk by increasing our own R&D. For obsolescence, we can avoid the risk by further developing our product lines so that we're not dependent upon a single product, or by increasing our family of products so we have interdependent products, so that the change in one, by making one obsolete, doesn't necessarily put us out of business because we have a family of interrelated products. For our internet outage, we've decided that risk is minimal. We can't do anything about it, so we accept that risk. And for storm damage, we've bought insurance, so we've transferred that risk. And those may be decisions or decision recommendations made to leaderships based on the metrics that we have. And so what you see is that as these decisions are made, we've now updated our business goals and objectives, and we need to make sure that that's documented into our plans and that our metrics are also updated based on any changes made in those types of decisions. So if you're still with me, I have a quick summary for you, and that is business problems really drive the metrics. Okay, every business has problems. That's why we have business plans and business strategies. Our metrics should inform the assessments, and the assessments inform every part of what we do with our business. So what you see is that metrics become a guiding factor for how we drive our business forward. They need to be specific to our business and our business problems, which is why I have not sat here today and said, you need to have this metric, and this metric. I don't know your business. I don't know your business problems, so I can't tell you, what your metrics could or should be. If you need help, I'm always willing to sit down and discuss with you and help you work through both the problems, plans, and what metrics you have available to you and you may be able to use. But your best metrics typically come from you because you have the most thorough understanding of your own business problems. And then you use a continuing assessment to use those metrics so that you can move your business forward while limiting your exposure to risk. That's all I have, and we have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you, Lynn. Such wonderful, useful information. I know that we do have a few questions. Gordon, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, and thank you for this presentation. It's very encouraging for people starting businesses or wanting to grow businesses and all. My question is how micro can you get on this to where you kind of develop your own paralysis from driving this down to, I was thinking, your military background, the metrics, the assessment of metrics is substantially different to the squad leader than it is to the G3 office. And so I'd just like you to speak to how you can avoid paralysis by using metrics at what levels.
You know, you are right on point on that. And what I've typically counseled people is that when I look at levels of organizations, I want to develop plans and objectives and metrics that can roll up. So I want to, you know, at my top level, at every level, you want to limit the metrics to the minimum amount of information you need to know in order to make a decision. Because once you cannot get perfect information, and information that you have is going to be wrong. So you have to get the best available information at a point of time, minimum amount of information needed to make a decision. Okay, now theoretically, let's say we've got 3 levels of the organization. So I've got my directors, and then I've got my managers, and then I've got my team leaders. So when you're developing your plan, you've laid out top level goals and objectives for the company. Each set of managers underneath that should take those goals and objectives and break them down, you know, to the minimum number that they need to guide their level of the organization. And then the same thing is that the team should break down their next hires to the pieces that they need. And because each team has got a limited scope of responsibilities, you know, they break down the pieces of the objectives that apply to them, you know, and create the minimum number of metrics that they need in order to inform their leadership. And so in that way, the objectives and the goals roll down, the metrics roll up. Does that help?
Yeah, no, it's very specific to my question. And then I think what you said to start with is the leaders need to make decisions based on the information that flows up from below. In other words, the generals aren't going to be making decisions based on what they think, but what the colonels and the sergeants tell them and all that, right?
It's actually the commanders, and if we're talking military, commanders always have information that the staff below them doesn't have, because they're out in the field and they're talking to other commanders and they're pulling in that subjective information that I talked about earlier. And so they a lot of times develop an understanding of what's going on that is complementary to the hard information that comes up through the metrics channel. And so your business leaders too get out and they talk to other leaders within the community. They get a feel for what's going on, and the really good ones have you know, some subjective judgment capability that they add on to the metric-driven analysis that comes to them. And if they're really good and they make a decision that doesn't necessarily align with their recommendation of their directors, then they explain back to their people why they made that decision, because that enables the staff to then look for indicators of the things to either confirm or deny that judgment that or insight that the leader may have from other sources.
Great questions, Gordon. Thank you. Anyone else? If you feel more comfortable putting something in the chat, please do that. Lynn, I know there's a lot of nice comments in there about your presentation and thanking you.
I've got one more.
Okay.
But do you think in this regard all the time, 24/7? I mean, when you walk into a situation, you break down the metrics and think I would do it.
I would like to say I did, but you know, it's one of those things where I find it a lot of times more useful to sit back and think about it separately. because if you're not actively thinking about it, you're actively listening, you take in a lot of information that you don't necessarily know that you're taking in. And so I am a prolific note taker as well. I'm talking to somebody, I'm writing stuff down, observations, things they say, those kind of things, so that I take it back with me and I review those things, and then I see those kind of things. But I find it useful to just use dedicated time to sit and think and review the business plans, and then review the information that we have with it.
Lynn, I have a quick question. This is Cindy Appicelli. So where's a good place to start? Is it a good idea to start with a problem and work it through? Is it a good idea to start with a SWOT? Especially if you have a team that maybe has not done a lot of work around metrics and strategic planning and that kind of stuff. Where is a good area to take your first stab at and see where you go?
Do you have a business plan at all?
So I'm new in the organization, so I wasn't part of developing anything that we have. There is a strategic plan, but I would say there's not a lot of ownership of the strategic plan. It's kind of something they had to check off the list.
I guess I would start with that strategic plan and look at it from my point of view, and start with, where do we want to go? Where do we want to end up in the future? And then come back and do an analysis of where are we right now. I am working with a number of colleagues to develop a process for creating that assessment. I have a construct that I call DEEPest that helps me outline what the strategic environment is for business, where you're looking at things like, what are the demographics, what's the economics, what's the business environment, what's the laws, what is the information technology piece of things, so that you kind of get a holistic evaluation of what's going on internally and externally right now that impacts my business. And then from that, looking at that and looking to where you want to go, develop your objectives or your options for how to get to where you want to go. In the military, we typically refer to it as lines of effort or lines of operation, because you may have multiple things that you need to do that are significantly different to get to your end state. So if you're in a business, you have to have marketing, you have to have sales, you may have to have production, you may have to have distribution and logistics. And so each one of those has to have a set objective at the top level, and then some sub-objectives underneath that for how they're going to put that action in place in order to get there. Once you understand what those actions are, then you can start building out the pieces to those, and what are the metrics that inform whether or not you're making progress along each one of those objectives or sub-objectives. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Thanks, Cindy. That was a great question. Well, we are out of time, Lynn. Again, thank you. Thank you for your sponsorship. Thank you for your very informative presentation, and we appreciate everyone being here. Our next business exchange will be next year. So January 13th, clearly simple, and watch for more details to come. We have business after hours over Zoom on Monday evening, hosted by Van Horn Nissan, Stevens Point. So I hope that you can make that. Please register in advance. You can find that information from an email that I sent out this week. I'll also send out another one on Friday. So have a great day. Thank you all.
Thank you.